So, last night, Friday, when we're all going home ready for the weekend, we were notified that the Prime Minister was going to be making an urgent announcement. And so he did. Michael Portillo, what did you think?
Well, I thought precisely what you've said was bizarre. I mean, if we have a problem with extremism, and if there have to be legislative changes, which are both perfectly reasonable points of view, then surely the Prime Minister would go to the House of Commons, which is the place where legislation is made. House of Commons was sitting last week, it was sitting the week before. We know that because there was turmoil on both occasions. So to come out on a wet Friday evening and announce important measures about extremism struck me as a very odd way to do it. And, of course, puts the Prime Minister in a position where he doesn't have to answer any questions.
Yeah, I mean, if you were watching or listening to it, he claimed that democracy is under threat from extremism in the wake of Hamas's October the 7th attack on Israel. Now, in a speech, which Michael says was very bizarre, he said there's forces here at home trying to tear us apart. Let's take a listen.
I fear that our great achievement in building the world's most successful multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy is being deliberately undermined. There are forces here at home trying to tear us apart. On too many occasions recently, our streets have been hijacked by small groups who are hostile to our values and have no respect for our democratic traditions. Threats of violence and intimidation are alien to our way of doing things. They must be resisted at all times.
I think many of us, when we were first told that he was making that announcement, thought he's going to call an election. Because you don't...
Or even quit.
Did you think that was a possibility?
Well, I just thought, you know, we've so often heard that the podium is going to be positioned outside number 10 Downing Street, and it normally does presage very important news of the sort that you describe. I also think, you know, what also made it slightly bizarre was to talk about extremism on the day that you're responding to a by-election in which your party has been annihilated, and, by the way, so is the chief opposition party, makes it look as if you're saying the by-election, and there was a reference to the by-election in the speech, makes it look as if you're saying the by-election is the big symptom of extremism. I think that introduces quite an unfortunate confusion into the issue.
Yeah.
Because people would say, oh, well, you would say that because you were defeated in the by-election. Do you know what I mean?
Yes,
It kind of cheapens it because it makes it a response to the by-election rather than a response to everything that has been happening since October the 7th and indeed before that.
Because he said that the Rochdale by-election result, his words were, it was extremely alarming.
Yes.
Now, that's almost criticising the nearly 6,000 people who voted for George Galloway. Almost
the 12,000 people.
Sorry, the 12,000.
Yes.
Isn't it? It's almost saying your vote's just weird, just writing them off in a way, which is not a good move.
I think to describe a democratic event as alarming, to imply that a democratic event, an election, is a symptom of extremism, is very problematic. I mean, of course, you can say that the candidate who's been elected is someone who's espoused extremism. You'd have to make the case very carefully, because George Galloway is very good at arguing back. But I mean, you could make that case. But you need to be very careful not to say that the decision of thousands of people is in itself an extreme event.
Well, let's bring in senior political analyst at Orthodox Conservatives, David Moore, to talk about this, and also political commentator Peter Spencer. A very good morning to you both. David, Michael described it as bizarre. What did you think of Rishi Sunak's speech in the pouring rain in Downing Street on a Friday evening?
Well, I think it was a strong call that there was something very unprecedented going on. Now, we saw Mr Galloway winning by-elections in the past, for example, for the Respect Party, especially after when he left the Labour Party over Iraq. But what we're seeing at the moment and what we saw was a very toxic by-election where it was decided by a foreign policy tragedy, exploiting that foreign policy tragedy, using the flags of Palestine to basically say, this is what I'm standing purely on this ticket. And when people asked him what he was actually going to do for Rochdale, there wasn't any answer at all. And what the Prime Minister was saying is this country needs more social cohesion. As someone who is a social conservative at the moment, we're divided, we're in fear at the moment, and especially over a situation where Britain, quite frankly, doesn't have a political stake anymore, at least not controlling that area. This idea that we can just send in the troops and enforce a ceasefire, when the fact of the matter is we are using diplomatic channels, as the Foreign Secretary is doing at the moment. So we're seeing a by-election dominated purely on foreign policy grounds, and potentially more in the future. So I think the Prime Minister had a strong message to say. Yes, I agree with Michael. It was very unprecedented.
Well, yes, David, let me pursue that with you. I mean, supposing we agreed with every word that you've just said, every word that the Prime Minister has said, why on earth not go to the House of Commons? He was talking about legislation. He was talking about changing the law. Is not the House of Commons the place to do that?
Well, indeed, I think the House of Commons, especially when other MPs can table such questions and, again, hold the executive to account, absolutely. But I think there is an unprecedented situation in this country at the moment where MPs are standing down because they are fearful, MPs' offices torched, fantastic statesmen and women who fear they can't run again, Jewish children who fear of going to school, and all forms of hatred from also that, we see people like Nick Griffin at the far right endorsing Mr Galloway in that election. So we're in a country at the moment where fear is rife and that people don't feel they can speak up. And it's about time we have a Prime Minister who can, and I think he is doing that. And during that speech, he was still heckled from outside. So I think it's about time also the police really start cracking down on extremism as well.
Well, hang on. He was heckled from outside. I mean, that's not an extremist threat, is it? Let's be honest. And bring in Peter Spencer, political commentator. Peter, what did you make of it? Rishi Sunak speaking from the heart, or was it all political posturing?
Very much political posturing. I mean, this wasn't a policy, this was a speech. He didn't really say anything that he hasn't already said. He's already had the mob rule stuff and already had the announcement about the £30 million for MP security. He did, however, very effectively times away from George Galloway and on to him. I mean, you guys are being gloriously rude about the whole thing, but the fact is that the newspapers were rather less critical, just said, oh, Rishi Sunak has spoken up. I think what's behind all this is a very real fear on his part of George Galloway. Now, of course, Galloway is a threat to the Labour Party because of the historic anti-Semitism, but also, I mean, George Galloway, whether you love him or hate him, and many people do hate him, he is one hell of a class act when it comes to rhetoric. I mean, he's up there when it comes to mobilising English language. He's up there with Winston Churchill or indeed our esteemed colleague Nigel Farage, who managed to deliver Brexit single-handed. And that is a threat not only to the Labour Party, but also to the Conservatives.
Peter, were you surprised then, given your criticism, given my criticism for that matter, that Sir Keir Starmer appeared to be very appreciative of the speech, kind of rode in behind it and said, oh yes, we're at one with the Prime Minister on the need to fight extremism. Was that surprising?
I think not, because Starmer most certainly is also frightened of George Galloway. And I come back to his extraordinary rhetorical prowess. I mean, he's got more going for him when it comes to delivering speeches than Starmer or Sunak put together. He's very, very good at it. And now he will have one of a platform in the form of the House of Commons. Just imagine at Prime Minister's Question Time when he comes out with something really outrageous, who's going to get the headlines? Is it going to be Sunak or is it going to be him? It's going to be him.
David, the Liberal Democrats and SNP were far more critical and scathing of what Rishi Sunak had to say. Liberal Democrats said Tories have sown the seeds of division for years. The SNP said they are the architects of the culture war in the UK, i.e. the Prime Minister needs to look a bit more inwardly.
Well, quite frankly, the Liberal Democrats don't like this country. They sold off our sovereignty to the European Union. The SNP also don't like this union either, so I don't take any lessons from them about that. I think Rishi is trying to unite a country here, a country that is concerned about a rise in extremism and domestic threats. And also, we spoke about Mr Galloway's rhetoric. Yes, he might be quite impressive at the dispatch box, but at the end of the day, let's look at his record on action supporting proxies that hate this country, that hate the Liberal Democratic and also Conservative values of this country. He has supported the war in Ukraine, so he's not an anti-war candidate. He very much has been a Putin apologist in the past. Yes, he said it wasn't ideal, but of course when Putin moved in, he started blaming the West as per and NATO. He also supports Hezbollah as well, these Islamist proxy for Iran, and he supported many other dictators as well. So I'm very much concerned about this result myself.
David and Peter, thank you very much indeed. Do you know, I rather wonder whether the Speaker of the House of Commons, if he's recovered his self-belief, might say to the Prime Minister, look, that's the sort of statement that should be made to the House of Commons, not on a Friday evening in Downing Street.
Really? You think you should pull him aside about it?
It's the sort of thing that speakers in the past have been very exercised about, quite rightly.
OK, we will see what happens.